Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here with you in beautiful, not quite so warm Melbourne. It's a privilege to be here with you and talking about a topic very close to my heart, marriage and money. I've been married for 13 years now, and money obviously can have all sorts of interesting impacts on your marriage. In fact, the number one cause of divorce in Australia, sadly, is financial conflict. So I want to help you by giving you guys some biblical wisdom and some skills which I think will really help you in your marriage over the next 2 hours that we've got together. Now, because I'm in finance, we live in the world of disclaimers these days, which is really just saying this is financial education. I'm not trying to give you personal financial advice, but what it really says is that I was never actually here. Okay, so just keep that in mind, although there is video evidence, I'm afraid. So as was mentioned, I've spent most of my adult life in finance. Originally in stockbroking, and then I moved into financial planning, and have really spent most of my time helping people with retirement planning, investments, insurance, that kind of thing. So I want to share with you some of those skills I've learned, and then really God's taken me on a bit of a journey over the last sort of 10 years in trying to say, well, how do you actually apply the Bible to our finances? Because one thing that people are often surprised to find out is the most talked about issue in the Bible is money. In fact, roughly 15% of Jesus' preaching, roughly 11 of the 39 parables that he told, and between the Old and New Testament, there is something like 2,350 verses on money, wealth and possessions. And the question, of course, would be why? Why would God talk so much about money in his word? And I think the reality is he knew that we would struggle with it, okay? And I'm not necessarily talking about struggle with it in the day-to-day sense of saving, which, you know, is an issue for people, but in the spiritual sense and our relationship to money and what it can do to us. Because many of the passages in the Bible about money are actually warning messages about what money can do to you. And really, it's the impact that it can have and take you away from God. In fact, one of my favourite verses is in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18, where it says, "Remember the Lord, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth." Now, the reason why I love that is when I look at Australia today, and we look, and if we're honest, we look at the direction this nation's heading, we'd have to say it's not the right direction. And what's happened is we've got more prosperous. We've forgotten the Lord. We've forgotten where all our blessings come from. And that's one of the things that we're up against. But I think this passage here really summarises why this is such a critical issue. So I'll read this passage from Matthew 6. It says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So here's the thing, money is the ultimate heart issue. And it can be a huge competitor with your relationship with God. Okay? And I would argue that money is very seductive. We often don't realise the impact that it's having on us and in our lives. Then if we look at Australia in a bit of detail, the average Australian struggles with money. According to ING Bank, the average Aussie would run out of money in just 47 days of losing their job. Okay, 47 days. So most people have roughly up to 6 weeks worth of savings. Okay, now if you go back to the global financial crisis 10 years ago, in America, if you lost your job, it took 180 days to find another one. And of course, they are similar to us, where they also run out of money after just 5 or 6 weeks. So it's a real issue. And of course, the Bible says, and this is a great passage from Hosea, is that my people perish from lack of knowledge. So I want to congratulate you for being here today, because part of the idea of today is obviously sharing some wisdom from the Bible, but then practical skills about that you can apply into your personal finances and of course into your marriage. But I want to begin with a bit of interaction here. And I want to ask you this question. What is the biblical purpose of money? The four main ones. Obvious one, providing for our needs. Second thing, which was mentioned, bless others, especially help the poor. Of those 2,350 verses, there are roughly 900 that talk about helping the poor. So one of the big mandates for Christians is that we need to help people who are in need. Very, very important. Funding the Great Commission, of course. And of course, what you do with your money is an act of worship. Now, we often think about worship as singing and things like that, which of course it is. But what you do with your money is an act of worship. Okay? We should use our money to glorify God. So here's the thing about money. As I said, there's tons of passages on it, but it's very seductive. It's often reflective of our spiritual condition. In fact, I would say that money has a real impact on our character. Okay? Think about if people do their tax returns honestly. Okay? That says a lot about their personal character, and it can obviously influence in that. The reality is that many passages in Scripture about money are actually warning messages. Okay? By the way, nowhere in the Bible does it paint money as dirty or evil. The church has always had this sort of funny relationship with money. We haven't always articulated really well what the Bible says. Money, for the most part, is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. But it can be a tool for doing good, or it can be a tool for doing evil. And that's why we need to make sure that we master it. And of course, we now live in this culture of debt. Australia, this may surprise some people, but Australia is the second most indebted households on earth. And I'm sure you all know that here in Melbourne because your house prices are rather high, to say the least. Okay? And that's driven by record household debt. So the primary focus, and thank you to this gentleman over here who mentioned the key word, is stewardship. Okay? We need, as believers, is to learn what is good stewardship. Now, I want to give you a definition that I stole from stewardship.com. Gotta love the internet. And they say that stewardship is managing God's blessings in God's ways and for God's glory. Okay, now I'm sure you'd all agree that just to live in Australia is to be enormously blessed. Okay, if you earn more than $50,000 a year, then you are in the top 1% to 2% of the world. And just to be in Australia, if you're on Centrelink in Australia, you're still in the top 5% of the world. Okay, we are enormously blessed as a nation. And let's hope that continues. But are we doing it God's ways? And that's where I think the wheels start to come off, and we'll explore some of these issues. And then the third thing, are we doing it for God's glory? Are we using our money to fund the kingdom, to advance God's kingdom here on earth? You know, I'm 43. I can't believe how quickly life is going by. I've got 4 kids. I look in the rear vision mirror and I go, whoa, how on earth did they get there? I know how they got there. But boy, it goes quick. And my real encouragement to you is to run your race for Jesus and to use the money that God has blessed you with, whether it's a little or a lot. It'll all vary from person to person. And how do you use that to advance God's kingdom in the short time that we have here? So that's the key point number 1, is that we are stewards. Okay? And so my encouragement for you is to think of the money that you have as being God's money. In Psalm 24 verse 1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's in all its fullness, including those who dwell therein." So not only is everything belong to God, but you belong to God. In fact, I like the story of John Wesley. There was a story about John Wesley. He was out horseback riding one day, and this gentleman rode up to him on horse and said, Mr. Wesley, your house is burnt down." Now, let's be honest, if someone came up to you and said your house had just burnt down, you'd be pretty upset. And John Wesley sort of paused and thought about it for a moment, and he looked back at this guy and he said, "No, you're mistaken. It was the Lord's house that burnt down, and now I've got one less thing to worry about." Okay? So here's a man who held money loosely. So that's one thing I'd really want to encourage you. You know, money can come and go really quickly. Okay? We need to hold money loosely. Okay? And that's a real challenge for us in our society that's obsessed by money. But let's sort of divert now and start looking more at marriage and what the Bible says about that. So let's look at a couple of passages here. So in Matthew 19 it says, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." And then Ephesians, it says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. So I want to explore in a moment what it means to be two becomes one from a financial perspective. Okay? But what's God's intention for marriage? In reality, money should bring us closer. The truth is, of course, in many marriages, it does the opposite, right? It causes tension and conflict. Usually, it's the conflict between what I call needs versus wants. I need the latest Apple Watch, right? My wife says, you don't need that. You just want it. Okay, and that's the sort of thing we're up against. We all have slightly different needs versus wants, and these perceived differences can affect the decisions we make. Of course, it should bring unity. It should bring balance to decisions. That's one of the big things. God puts you, husband and wife, together to complement each other. We're not, if you believe the media, you'd think we're in competition. You think it's like a gender war going on out there. But in reality, it's actually no, we're to complement each other and make good decisions together. And of course, we should love and serve one another with money, rather than use money to lord over each other, which often happens in many marriages. So we need to look at what does the world say about some of these issues versus what God says. So, for example, the world has this view now that we should all be fiercely independent. That's not what the scripture says. Really, the truth is that we need to be interdependent on each other. In fact, we need to be dependent on God as our source of provision, but we need to be helping each other. One of the things, let's apply that to the real world for the moment. Bank accounts. Should we have separate bank accounts? I don't think so. My personal view, from a transparency point of view, is that you operate joint accounts, so everyone knows where the money is. I've had, as a financial planner, many people come into my office where the spouse doesn't know what the other spouse is earning. Bank accounts are separate. They don't know what the bonuses are. They have really no idea what's going on with each other's finances because they're completely separate. I've seen that with inheritances. I had a lady come into my office. She just received an $800,000 inheritance. And I said, where's your husband? You say you're married. She said, well, it's nothing to do with him. It's not his inheritance. Whereas my view is I would argue it's all God's rather than just his or hers. So these are some of the issues that come up. Our society now is obsessed by rights. My right for this, my right for that. The Bible actually says, no, what are your responsibilities? You've got to take responsibility. The world says, me first. Once again, if we go back to Scripture, Christians are great with cliches. God is first in my life. But here's the thing, is he first with your money? Okay? Is he first with your money? The world's all about withholding and keeping for yourself, whereas believers, we need to live freely with what we have. The world says, no, it's all about meeting my needs and my expectations, whereas the biblical model is serving, meeting others' needs. Here, it's all about I'm the focus, whereas over here, partner in Christ is the focus. What's it say? Seek first his kingdom. The world is all about happiness, whereas the truth is our vision should be both for our family and for building God's kingdom and for others. So the big challenge, though, that many of us face is we don't understand each other. Anyone feel like that occasionally? Don't quite know why your spouse does what they do? Okay? Maybe you don't want to admit that if they're sitting right beside you. But this is the reality. Many of us don't quite understand why our spouse is behaving in their particular way towards money. And here's the thing. When you go into marriage, we often go into it with different expectations, what it's going to look like. I'm always amazed when you talk to couples how little they've actually spoken about money before they've actually got married. Different upbringings, okay? Different cultures that people come from. Different spiritual maturity. If you're married to someone who doesn't share your faith, or someone who's at a different stage in their faith. Different personalities. And of course there are gender differences too, which we often gloss over. But let's talk about expectations. When you got married, did you have a particular expectation about the kind of house you live in? Huh? The kind of holidays you go on? Schooling. There's a massive world of difference from a price point of view between public and private schooling. Okay? All those sort of things. What about career and income? The kinds of jobs you would have. The priorities. Children and family. How many kids were you going to have? Have these issues. When you came into marriage, did you know what your spouse thought about those things? So often we come in with very different expectations. But then we have our different upbringings. Some of you might have grown up in a house where everything was sort of hoarded away. And others, probably like me, grew up in a house where everyone's good at spending money, okay, and likes having a good time. So those different things will affect how we manage money. Maybe money was talked about openly. For other houses, it might have been a taboo issue, very closed and no one really wants to talk about it. Others, you might have grown up where money was not really a big deal, pretty calm, and others where you heard people fighting about you heard your parents fighting about money all the time. So these are all the sorts of things that we bring into a marriage. Then, of course, there's gender differences. Now, this is always a hot potato, this kind of topic, but the reality is these are some things that are generally true, but not always true. Now, my experience, particularly as a financial planner, and certainly when I was in stockbroking, is that men generally take more risks, okay? And that's generally true just in the way they drive cars, but also in terms of the way they often manage money, okay? In fact, when I was in stockbroking, I used to work for a company called Merrill Lynch, big American broking firm, and they did a lot of research around this and came up with the view that women were better investors than men. And the reason for that was simply that women would buy good quality investments and hold them. They wouldn't sell them, they just hold them. Whereas my male clients, to be honest, are much better clients for a simple reason. They wanted to trade all the time. And so, of course, as a broker, it's all built around brokerage. And so they'd want to trade all the time because they're always trying to move on to the next thing. So these are some of the differences that we faced. Women generally want more security, okay? That's a generalisation, but generally the case. And men, and I see this a lot, men feel a huge burden to provide for their families. In fact, if you look at the stats, the average male goes into a mild form of depression within 1 month of losing their job. Okay? So that's something to be very sensitive of to your husbands if they lose their jobs. So that's a reality for many people. It's a big issue that many people face. Then, of course, as I mentioned before, different spiritual maturity in terms of, if we're talking about things like tithing and giving money to church, and your partner doesn't share the same beliefs as you do, then you're going to have conflict around that kind of thing, around how you're going to live generously. Okay, so that's a real issue. Then, of course, there's personality differences. There are some people, like my grandmother, who managed to hoard away everything. She is the only person I know who could save on the age pension. Okay? Don't know how you do it, given how big the age pension is, but she managed to do it. Okay, and there's others who just spend. Okay, so all these things affect us. Some people avoid money, that is, they don't like talking about it. Okay, and then there's risk takers versus risk avoiders, and you put these. I'm trying to remember that myself. You put these things in, and you think, I haven't read that for a while. But here's the thing: what are the values that drive your behaviour? So, and how they affect your decision making. So here, I put up here a range of money values. Okay. Now, with these money values, not all of them are necessarily good, right? In the sense they're not necessarily godly, if you like, okay? But if you look at them, security, status, identity, generosity, power, all these sort of things that come out of it. Some of them are positive, and some of them you would argue are negative from a Christian perspective. But what are your money values? And do you know what they are yourself for your own? And do you know what they are for your spouse? So, for example, what value is going to be for someone who grew up in a house where money was really tight? The parents struggled to make bills, pay the bills. What kind of values are they likely to have? What about security? If they're always worried about money and the parents couldn't pay the bills, likely to be very security conscious. Now, and often in that case, they may act out of fear. So someone who acts out of fear, they're more likely, rather than saving, so if you look at, the Bible makes a very big distinction between saving versus hoarding. So saving is a good thing. Saving, putting money aside for the future, is sensible. Hoarding, on the other hand, is storing up money that's never going to be used. And there's no clear purpose to it. And often that's done out of fear. Okay? And it's hoarded away and never used. It has got no purpose to it. And so these values here shape us. They affect us in a big way. And what are the implications for these in terms of the way you guys communicate about money? How you talk to each other? Then there's, of course, the in-laws, or as my father calls them, the outlaws. Okay? How do they affect your marriage? Are they involved in your marriage? Do your in-laws, for example, give you money? Now, on face value, that might sound like a good thing. And a lot of parents, they want to help their children, right? That's a good thing. They want to help their children. But sometimes that can come with strings attached in terms of how long you need, how often you've got to see them, the kind of what things you're allowed to do with the money, all this sort of stuff. And so your in-laws can have a negative impact on your marriage. What about also if you have let's say you've got the dopey brother-in-law and he's always asking for money because he's struggling? How's that going to affect your marriage? If your brother-in-law is tapping you on the shoulder, asking for money all the time, and your spouse says, oh yeah, let's just give him the money. And you say, well, hang on a minute, are we ever going to see it again? Anyone know what the default rate is on people lending money to family and friends? The default rate in the banking sector at the moment is less than 1% of home loans going south. The default rate on lending money to family and friends is about 50%. So there's a bit of a cliche, and that is, if you're going to lend money to family or friends, decide which one you want to keep. The money or the friend. Okay? So this is the sort of thing that can affect us. And these are things, as couples, you need to come to an agreement. Okay? My view is if you've got people asking you for money, give it to them as a gift that you do not expect back, because you're not going to get it back or you're going to lose the friendship. Okay? So you've got to think through these sort of things quite carefully before you go doing them. Exploring each other's attitudes. What is your attitude towards home ownership? What about cars? Education, the kind of clothes you wear. Okay, these may all sound like small things, but they become big things if they're not dealt with. What about giving? The organisations you're going to support. What about insurance? Making sure you've got that in place. Household items. Where you live. Where you live can be, quite cheap or extremely expensive when you look at Australian society, right? So where you live is a big choice. It can affect all sorts of things. Working arrangements, when kids arrive. Are both of you going to work? When are you going to have time off? All those sort of things. The kind of career you have, the kind of holidays you have. All these things we need to make sure we understand with each other, and we need to talk about them. What I find is problematic with couples is they never sit down and actually talk about this stuff in just a calm way. And so these things just tend to blow up over time. So one of the things I want to encourage you to do is to go on a money date. Okay? Now you can do this fancy if you want. Go out to a fancy restaurant. We can go to a local coffee shop. Or if you don't want to go out because you've got, like me, 4 kids and you think, oh man, this is too hard, do it over the dinner table. But sit down and actually pray together and actually go through your finances. What are our goals as a couple? What are the things we want to achieve with the money that God's blessed us with? How are we spending our money? And work your way through these things and actually talk about it as a couple. Explore these sort of issues. And here's the thing. These days, we're bombarded with messages about money. And the question is, where are you getting your messages from? Is it from your parents? Is it from your friends? Now, sometimes they can be very well-meaning and very wrong. Okay? Sometimes they give you great advice. Other times it's done out of love, but it's not necessarily good advice. Maybe it's from work colleagues, the Bible, your spouse, or just the media. Okay? But here's the thing. Does it actually line up with God's word? Okay? So if we took debt, if I picked on debt as an issue, as I said, Australia's the second most indebted households on earth. One of the things the Bible says about debt, by the way, debt is not sinful. Okay? Nowhere does it suggest it's sinful. However, it does warn us that debt can lead to slavery. Okay? It says the borrower can become the servant of the lender. And that's, I think, a very real issue for this country, and we'll explore that a bit later on. But here's the thing. Is your level of debt so substantial that it's completely out of alignment with God's word? And you're running your risk of ending up in slavery. Okay? And I think that's a real issue for many people. So one of the key points here is involve God in your financial decisions. How many people actually pray before they make big decisions, like buying cars? Where am I going to live? Should I rent or buy? How many people actually involve God in these decisions? So my view is you need to seek God and include him in all these decisions. You want to be spirit-led, not led just by emotion. So what happens when people buy houses and things like that? It's all done out of emotion. They see a house and they go, oh, isn't that pretty? And they fall in love with it. and they make decisions out of emotion rather than rationally and calmly, and of course involving God in the decision making. Okay, so very important that we include God. The next step is laying the right foundations. Okay, and so this is now where we're going to start to get practical. So I'm going to deal with some of the spiritual side of things. Now we want to get really practical here. The starting point for this is setting goals. Now, for those of you who are business people, you'll have seen some of these goals, this acronym before. These are what we call SMART goals. That is, goals should be specific, they should be measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Okay, and I'll unpack what that may look like. Let's pick on a specific example. Let's say you've got a mortgage, and you say, right, my goal is to pay off. I've got a $200,000 mortgage. I want to pay that off in 10 years' time. Is it specific? Yep, got the mortgage, I want to pay it off. Is it measurable? Yeah, it's $200,000, so I've got to know how much I've got to pay off. Is it achievable? Well, that may be dependent on my ability to save and how much I earn. Relevant? Yes, well, obviously I want to get out of debt over time. And time-bound, and the key one here is often time-bound. A lot of people leave time off their goals. And as a result, guess what? They don't plan it because, oh yeah, it's just somewhere in the future. So have key time frames for when you want to achieve your goals by. They should be time-bound. Okay, now there's all sorts of other goals that we can look at. The other way to look at it, and this is what I go through when I do it with financial planning with clients, is having short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term. So long-term, fairly obvious, things like retirement planning. Medium-term, maybe you've got young kids and you want to put them in private school, and of course private school, as we know, is not cheap. And so you want to save and set money aside to make sure you've got enough money to fund their education. And you might have short-term goals, which might be maybe you need to upgrade your car in the next year or two, or you want to go on an annual holiday, all these kinds of things, right? So have very clear goals you want to achieve. Now, my view is set a framework. A friend of mine is a Christian business coach, and he uses this framework for his goal setting. Okay? He calls it the 5 Fs. Faith, family, fun, finances, and fitness, which I think is a really useful way of thinking about your goals. Because goals don't have to be just financial. Okay? They can be all these other sorts of things. You know, family goals, what you want to do as a family, make sure you have fun, all that kind of thing. Then, I think you should have eternal goals. What will be the legacy of your life? What's going to be left behind? Okay? What are the things you're going to do to extend God's kingdom? Okay? What do you feel God is putting on your heart to do? So have your eternal goals. But let's look at some examples here. Let's look at a common financial goal. So one of the very common ones, of course, is retirement planning. And so here's a typical one that I would talk to clients about. Achieve financial independence by age 65, where I need a capital sum of 1.2 million that gives me an income of $60,000 per annum. Now, is it specific? Yes. I need 1.2 million. Is it measurable? Yeah, okay, I need $1.2 million by the time I get to 65. Is it achievable? Well, that depends on my ability to obviously save and work towards it. Is it relevant? Well, yeah, I want to retire at some point. Is it time-bound? Yes, I need to do it by age 65. Okay? So you need to have these kind of parameters to work out what it is that you're going to need. Okay? What about some eternal goals? Now, maybe you want to give away a certain amount of money in your lifetime. For others, maybe you're giving 10% now, and each year you want to increase it. Okay? You want to increase it next year 11%, year after that 12%. In fact, if you listen to people like Rick Warren, because his book was so successful, he now reverse tithes, so he gives away 90%. Okay, so there's all these sorts of things to think through. Maybe you want to start, you feel God's putting on your heart to start a charity or a mission, or he wants you to serve the church with your particular talent and ability. What are the things that God is putting on your heart? Things that are going to have eternal value. Okay, so there's some of the goals. That's sort of the starting point. Now, also notice some of you are taking pictures. At the end, we've got a feedback form, and if you guys would like the slides from this, you can access the slides. Okay, so you don't need to take pictures. We'll make sure we give you the slides that you can take home. So that's the next step. So getting this foundation in place, get your goals in place. The next step, create a spending plan. One of the biggest things that people struggle with is getting their spending under control. Anyone know what the national savings rate is in Australia? 1% is the savings rate. Okay, prior to the global financial crisis in 2008, Australia's savings rate in the decade leading up to it was -3%. Okay, the simple expression for that is called living beyond your means. If you go back to the 1970s, Aussies used to save 16% of their income. Okay, so we've now got this culture of spend, spend, spend. And there's always something we can be spending our money on. Okay, so if you want to get ahead, the key to getting ahead financially, and you've heard the cliche, live within your means. I think it's bad advice. You need to live beneath your means. Okay, to get ahead, you need to live beneath your means. So we need to work out a spending plan. Now, here's a word that makes people cringe, a budget. I think only something like 5% of Australians have a budget in place. Okay, but a budget is a very simple tool. It's how much money is coming into your house versus how much money is going out. Okay, and the goal, of course, is more money is coming in than going out. Otherwise, you're in deficit. And of course, that's got to be made up for some way. Maybe it's credit card debt and all these sort of things that people get themselves into. So we need to make sure more's coming in than is going out. Now, I would argue from a Christian point of view that doing a budget is your first act of stewardship. Okay? In fact, Jesus himself, he said this, suppose one of you wants to build a tower, won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Okay? So we need to plan ahead, and really a budget is just looking forward over the next 12 months to work out how am I going to spend my money? Okay? What am I going to do with the money that God has given me? How am I going to spend it? And really what this does, it's a tool of projection. So you're looking over the next 12 months, how am I going to spend my money? And then why people don't like doing it, of course, because it's a tool of self-awareness. And heaven forbid, we don't really want to really know how we're spending our money, do we? Okay? It's a tool to prevent financial shortfall. Okay, so you don't run out of money. It's a tool to achieve your financial goals. So if we talk about retirement and things like that, it's all well and good to do that. But if you know how much capital you need, but you don't know how much money you can save on a month-by-month basis, you never know if you're going to be able to get there or not. Okay? So doing a budget will help you understand your cash flow, how much money is coming in versus how much money is going out. And then lastly, it's a tool of Christian conviction. Am I living generously with the money that God's given me? Am I handling it well? Am I honouring God with my finances? So that's a very important one. And if you don't have a budget, here's the thing, you won't know if you're living beyond your means. You won't know if you're honouring God. You won't know if you're saving enough. So it's a critical thing. Of course, the question then becomes, well, how do I do a budget? How do I actually do one well? So I want to give you two ways of doing it. Okay. First thing is to either gather the documents together. So maybe you get your credit card statements, your bank statements, all those sort of things. In fact, someone once said to me, your bank statement's actually like a theological document, right? Because it tells me what you believe. It tells me what's important to you. Okay? How we spend our money says what's important to us, what's valuable. So we want to get our statements together, our insurance statements, maybe you've got shares, you've got dividends, or you've got investment properties. Gather all the documents together. So that's option one. Option two, go off to the news agency, buy yourself a little notepad, and walk around and for 1 month, write down every cent you spend. Okay, now this can be quite an eye-opening exercise. I've got 4 kids, so every weekend you seem to be at other kids' birthday parties, okay? And you're spending endless money on kids' presents and all this sort of stuff, right? So the largest line item in your budget is likely to be what I call the miscellaneous column, okay? And that's about 5 to 10% of your budget. Okay, so these are all the kinds of things that you think you don't really realise you're spending. Or, we're in the flu season at the moment where everyone's getting colds and so forth, and we go off to the chemist and spend, $20 on cold and flu tablets, all this sort of stuff. So there's all these little things that we don't normally think of. And so my view is in your budget, when you're preparing it, is at least 5 to 10% should be around this miscellaneous column, the things that we don't normally think about. So that's step one. Step two, so you've got all the documents together. We now want to write down, and maybe you can put this into a spreadsheet. In fact, if you go onto our website, wealthwithpurpose.com, you can actually download what's called My Toolkit, and in there is a budget planner, debt schedule, and a range of other tools that you can use. But what I want to write down here is all our sources of income. So maybe your salary, maybe you've got interest from bank accounts. You don't get much of that these days, do you? Social security, maybe you got dividends from your shares or rental properties. Write down all the money that's coming into your house. That's step one. Step two is then what we want to do is write down all our expenses. Now, if you look at our budgets, you'll find the number one line item is what I call giving to God. Because here's the problem. How do most Christians work out what they're giving to God? The sad reality is they work out all their other expenses first, their mortgage, their rent, their car expenses, and God gets the scraps. That's the reality how most people do it. But if we come back to this theological idea, the idea that God is first, then surely he should be first in our budget. And so my recommendation is that you prayerfully consider what are you going to give to God? And you work that out first, and then you work through the other expenses. As I say, most people do it the other way around. So what you're giving to God, what are you spending on your mortgage, your utilities, cars, insurances, and as I said, the big unknown one, the miscellaneous. So work out all your expenses and put that in a spreadsheet. Next step, we want to work out then what is fixed and what is variable. Okay, so things like, say, your mortgage, that's fixed. Very hard to change unless you obviously downsize your house or refinance your loan. Otherwise, it's generally a very hard expense to change. On the other hand, things like Netflix, Foxtel, Spotify, and all these other things, they're variable. Okay? You don't have to have them, and we can turn them on and off very easily. And part of the reason why I want to do this exercise is if you ever find yourself in a situation where you become unemployed, you get made redundant, you can turn off the variable expenses very, very quickly. Okay, so this is a tool just to help you gain control and give you a sense of what things can I work with, what can I adjust in my budget very quickly and easily, just to bring it back into line. Another aspect of this, and this is not quite part of your budget, but it's important to think through, is do you have any big expenditure coming up over the next 12 months? So for example, maybe you want to upgrade your car, renovate your house, or maybe you're saving to buy a house, all these sort of things. These are what I call your planned capital expenditure. Because the question is, how are these things going to affect your budget? If you're going to go and buy a new car, where's that money coming from? You know, are you borrowing the money or are you putting that money from savings? How does that affect your cash flow? So these are the sort of things that you need to think through. So we've worked that all out. Now here's the simple process that you need to follow. So step one, we record all our income. Step two, record our expenses. Now, step three, and this is the most important. The key, I can't emphasise this enough, the key to your long-term financial future is your surplus income. What you do with your surplus income will determine your long-term financial future. Are you going to save it? Are you going to invest it? Are you going to give it? Now, as a financial planner, one of the things I've observed over the years is as people earn more money, maybe you've heard the expression, the more people earn, the more they spend. Exactly right. I had this one couple, they're Aussies, but they were living in France. They were earning, his base income was 400 grand, and the bonuses on top of another 200 grand. Nice income. They spent the whole lot. Didn't save any of it. And this couple were about 60, I think 60, 62. And they wanted to retire, and they had 900 grand in super. Now, 900 grand in super is okay, but when you're used to spending 600, so after tax, let's say 350, 400 grand a year, how long is 900 grand going to last you in retirement when you're used to spending 300 or 400 a year? Not long, okay? And that's why we need to get a hold of these things and control them. So what is your surplus? What you do with that? If you're in deficit, then obviously you need to make adjustments quickly, because you're probably going into debt, racking up credit card debt. I was in Melbourne this time last year preaching in a church, and a guy came up to me afterwards and he said, I've got 90 grand in credit card debt. Okay, very hard to dig yourself out of that one. I advertised our ministry on Hope 103.2, Christian radio in Sydney, and I got a contact from this couple. They were both medical professionals, so earning very good income. But their total debt was 3 million. Of that, 120 grand of it was credit cards. So their interest bill a year was 150 grand. So despite both having very good jobs, guess how much they saved? 0. Okay? And this is a Christian couple. Okay? So we've got to, your surplus is your key to your long-term financial future. What is your surplus and what are you going to do with it? That's the key. Obviously, the other thing you want to do is calculate each expense as a percentage of the total. So are you spending too much on some areas and too little in other areas? And I'll unpack that a bit more in a moment. Determine which expenses are fixed and variable. I mentioned that before. And then we want to analyse it and say, am I living beyond my means? Am I spending too much money in some areas? Am I living generously? Am I handling the money well? And then, of course, the final step then will be we may need to make adjustments. Some of you might have lots of surplus income, so you can either give more or you can maybe even enjoy it a bit more. God is not a miser. He actually wants you to enjoy what he's given. Yes, he wants you to bless others and advance his kingdom, but you also got to enjoy what he's blessed you with. Okay? So there's a fine balance here as Christians. But some of us will need to actually adjust our expectations because maybe we're spending too much. Okay? And we're not going to save and reach our long-term goals unless we make adjustments to our finances. So, some of the key principles then to apply to our budget, and so both the Old and New Testament here, in Proverbs it says, honour the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Okay? And if we go to the New Testament, it says this, it says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. So the point simply is put God first with your finances. Now, I'm not going to get so much into the theology side of tithing and all those kind of issues, but merely I think in Western culture, the average person can afford to give to God at least 10% as a general rule. Now, that is not necessarily generous. Because if someone's earning a lot of money, 10% may not affect them in any way. Okay, so it's not necessarily generous. But to me, it's a good place to start. Okay, as I said, that's not really a theological comment. I just think it's a useful place to start in terms of how we manage our finances. But the point, though, is simply this. Put God first. Now, let's ask a question. Okay, this is to involve all of you now and share some views here. What lifestyle do you believe that God wants us to have? Okay, so there's some ideas. I'll give you some other passages here. A faithful person will be richly blessed, but one eager to get rich will not go unpunished. And Ecclesiastes 4, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What do we call that in today's day and age? Keeping up with the Joneses. Yeah? Sometimes we wish the Joneses would just move away. Job 36, if they obey and serve him, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. People love the prosperity bit, but they forget the obey and serve bit. Okay? So the primary issue here, though, is stewardship. How are we going to steward what God's given us? One parable that talks about this is the parable of the talents. Depending on what version of the Bible you read, in one it's called the parable of the gold bags, and in another version it's actually called the parable of the loaned money. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that the money you have is on loan to you from God. And that's a useful way to think about it. The money you have is actually on loan to you. So when we do our budget then, we need to then ask ourselves some questions. So we've gone through, we've analysed it. We say, well, does our budget honour God? Which expenses that we have do we really need? Are they essential? Are there things we can live without? Now, I just want to emphasise here, this is not about becoming a miser. It's not about becoming tight. God wants you to enjoy what he's given you. But as Christians, we walk this funny line where on the one hand, we need to meet our needs, and on the other hand, we need to bless others and extend God's kingdom. And it's a sort of a tension you'll live with between how much you use for yourself versus for blessing others and building God's kingdom. It's a tension that we're going to live with throughout our life. But that's the sort of thing you want to reflect on when you're doing your budget. What are you going to do with your surplus? Are you going to save it, invest it, give it? What are you going to do? And does it reflect an eternal perspective? Okay, now the big question I often get is, Alex, what does a good budget look like? What's it actually look like if it's good? So I want to give you simple formula that I call the 80-10-10 rule. Okay, simple formula to apply to your finances. That is, the first 10% is for giving to God. Second 10% is as a minimum for long-term saving. So you think about retirement, we think about saving for kids' education, maybe for some of you it's saving for your first home, but 10% for those long-term objectives. And then live on 80%. So I mentioned before, live beneath your means. So try and live on 80% of your income. Now, the big mistake people make these days is they spend too much on their accommodation. Now, whether this is renting or buying, either or. So typically, what I would suggest is that your accommodation expense should be no more than 30% of your budget. Now, we have a problem in our society, and that is that interest rates are so low. You can get a home loan for what? 3.5%? Anyone here have a home loan in 1990? No? All too young. What were interest rates in 1990? 17%. Yeah. So here's the question. If you think about your current level of mortgage, if interest rates were to double from where they are today, right? So if you take it for home loan at 3.5% and they went to 7%, what impact would that have on your ability to repay the loan, on your lifestyle, on your ability to raise your kids, to give generously? What impact would it have? Because interest rates are not going to stay this low forever. Now, I don't think the Reserve Bank is in any rush to put them up, but the reality is it's not going to stay that way forever. And my concern in Australia, which is the second most indebted households on earth, is that many people will become enslaved as rates eventually rise. Okay? Because they'll have too much debt. So this is a really serious issue. Now in Sydney, and I suspect the figures are similar here in Melbourne, about 12 months ago, to buy a house in Sydney on a 80% borrowing amount, so you have 20% deposit, borrow 80%, it took 44% of someone's income to buy a house for the average person. Now, house prices here are similarly stupidly high. And so many people are already way over the 30%. Okay? And so this is a real big issue for our society because house prices are so out of control. Now, I think the good news, particularly for young people, for those of you who don't own homes, I think prices will continue to soften over the years ahead because they're just so extremely overvalued. Okay? But the key issue here is the 80-10-10 rule, and what are you going to do with your surplus? Are you going to save it, you're going to invest it, or are you going to give it? As I mentioned before, we've got a free budget tool on our website, wealthwithpurpose.com, and you can download all these sort of tools. What are some of the danger zones that I see couples get into? Separate bank accounts. I strongly urge you, I mentioned this before, have joint bank accounts, okay? It's good for transparency and they're good for understanding each other. There's a couple of things where I think are exceptions to that. If someone's been divorced and remarried, and a lot of that divorce was around trust issues, I take the view that we've got to be gracious towards each other. So some things need to be rebuilt over time, rebuilding trust and things like that. So there are a number of situations where I think it can be appropriate to have separate. The other situation too, and one of the common things amongst couples is we don't necessarily agree on how we spend the money. So what I'd suggest in that situation, particularly if one's natural tendency is to be a bit of a spender and the other isn't, is that you come up with an agreed figure that I would call your monthly allowance. Okay, an agreed figure. Now for some of you that might be $500 a month, depending on your income, might be $1,000 a month, whatever that figure is. And you put that into two separate accounts, that's your allowance. Now the one who's the saver might keep building that up over months and months ahead. The other may go and spend the whole lot every month. Okay? And the idea here is that you have no say over how your spouse spends the money. What you have a say over is what the agreed figure is. Okay? What is our allowance going to be? Because what we're trying to do here is get control of the spending. Because one of the keys to financial success is this principle here. How you think about money will determine how you behave, and how you behave will determine the financial outcome. So the long-term reality is that 90% of your financial success will come from how you behave with money. Okay, so we need to get control over how we behave with it because that'll have a huge effect. So we need to get control here. Now, the other question, of course, and this is a common issue, is why does budgeting not necessarily work? Okay, so it's all well and good to create a spreadsheet and see how we spend the money, but the big thing here is trying to put belts and braces on it to control it. So what I recommend is what I call a bucket-based approach, okay, where you try and automate your finances. So some of you here, for example, probably get paid weekly, others fortnightly, some of you monthly. But let's say, for argument's sake, you get paid monthly. So the first day of the month you get paid. Day 2, 10% of the amount that's just been paid should be immediately transferred out to a long-term savings account. So you're automating the process. Out of sight, out of mind. You want to get the money out of your hands as quick as you can. I'd put it into a different bank where you're unlikely to log in and see it. You want to just try and house the money and automate it. Okay? So you need a few accounts here. One is your everyday expenditure, your long-term savings account, emergency account, I'll touch on that one in a minute, and you might want to have for bills. Now, there is no right or wrong here, okay? And I don't want you to create some people have like 10 bank accounts and a holiday account and this and the other. I'm not suggesting you overly complicate it like that, but merely to suggest you have a bucket-based approach where you try and get control over how you spend the money and what you're using it for. Because the big thing here is how you behave with money is the key to getting ahead. Now, the big problem I see also for couples is have you saved for a rainy day? Because life is one of these funny things where lots of unexpected things happen to us. But the problem is we can expect the unexpected. You know, things happen to people. They lose their jobs, people get sick, all these sorts of things. So what I strongly recommend for couples is that you have an emergency account. Okay, now the $1 million question is how much should you have in that emergency account? Now this is where financial planners might disagree slightly. My suggestion is you aim to have about 6 months worth of living expenses set aside in cash, in a highly liquid account. Okay? Now you might think, whoa, 6 months is a lot. Well, here's the thing, if that's the case, just start with as little as $1,000. Okay, set $1,000 aside, go onto Gumtree, flog some things off, get your $1,000, so you've got your savings account set aside for emergencies. And then what we want to do, which we're going to try and do the 80-10-10 rule, with that first 10% that you're going to save, put that into your emergency account until it's built up. Once it's built up to a reasonable level, you don't need to add to it anymore, and then you can start investing that 10% into long-term things towards your goals, kids' education, retirement, and so forth. Okay? So that's the kind of structure we want in place, but you need to prepare for a rainy day because now Australia is a sort of an unusual country in one sense. We have not had a recession in Australia for 28 years, which is unheard of in economic history. Typically, a business cycle lasts 7 or 8 years. Australia hasn't had one for 28 years. Now, my suspicion is there's one not too far off, and it'll probably be much bigger than what we're used to because so much excess is built up, i.e. the level of indebtedness is enormous. So the message here is save for a rainy day. Have money set aside for emergencies. Next step, debt. Okay, Australia is drowning in debt. Now let's pick on a credit card. If you have just say $4,300 in credit card debt, which might not sound like very much, if you only pay back the minimum that the bank expects you to pay back, which is 3% on a given month, then it would take you 31 years to repay it and you'd spend nearly 15 grand in interest. Okay, that's just off a $4,000 debt. And you're paying nearly $800 a year in interest. Okay, credit card debt is you don't want to have, paying interest on a credit card is a total waste of money. And one of my strong things to suggest to everyone here is that you move towards a debit card. Most banks will offer fee-free Visa debit cards. So you can still go online, do all those transactions, because there is something weird psychologically about credit cards. In fact, I was in the US a few months ago and the pastor said to me, credit cards are like plastic crack. Okay? That is, they're addictive. Okay? And people can't handle them. So my strong suggestion is do away with the credit card. Because here's the problem with credit cards. Getting to debt is really easy, but paying it off takes time. It's hard. It takes time to do it. So here's the thing. What does the Bible say about debt? Okay, we need to have a biblical perspective here. Now, the key thing I want to leave with you here is debt is not sinful. So I don't want anyone here feeling condemned by their level of debt or anything like that. I just want to help you to have a biblical perspective towards it. And really there's two main things. So I'll read out Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. It says, "The rich rules over the poor and the borrower becomes the lender's slave." So my concern in Australia, particularly as most home loans are variable, is at some point rates are going to rise and that's going to eat into people's incomes. And many of them will then become enslaved to banks if they're not already. Okay? The other passages, a couple of these suggest, is that you shouldn't guarantee somebody else's debt. Now, the most common one I see is parents or almost grandparents saying that they will guarantee their children's home loans. Now, the danger of that is you're putting your own home at risk when you guarantee somebody's debt and you run the risk of losing your own home. So you've got to be very careful about these things. The Bible suggests you should not do it. I think we need to do away with this debt-fueled culture that's flown now into the church as much as it has in the rest of the world. And that is to understand that God is our source of provision. I love this particular passage from Deuteronomy. It says, "The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season and to bless all the work of your hands. You will lend to many nations, but you'll borrow from none." So in fact, one of the things I often pray for people is that God will bless the work of your hands. Okay, bless whatever you're doing. So rather than trying to run after, borrowing money to get what we want, actually ask God to bless the work that you're involved in so that you do well. Philippians 4 says, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus." And then 2 Corinthians, and this comes back to the God of abundance that someone mentioned earlier. "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." So put another way, I refer that as we should be blessed in order to be a blessing to others. Okay? Or another way, money should flow through us. Okay? It shouldn't just stop with us, it should flow through us. Okay? And God is a God of abundance. I have not heard of a recession in heaven yet. Now, can anyone tell me where the word mortgage comes from? The history of the word mortgage. Okay, the word mortgage is a French word. Mort equals death, gage equals pledge. Now, unfortunately, the banks don't tell you that when you take out a mortgage. Okay, you're entering into a death pledge. Okay, now, some friends of mine went and worked in Dubai. And in Dubai, when the global financial crisis hit, if you lose your job and you default on your home loan, does anyone know what the punishment is if you default on your home loan in Dubai? Jail. This is actually law. In fact, I think in Ireland it's technically the law, although they didn't enforce it, obviously. But so the advice to expats was, if you lose your job and you don't have enough money to pay your mortgage, drive straight to the airport, hop on a plane and get out. That was the advice given to them, because that's how serious it is. Okay, so there's a bit of historical significance to that. But the point is, debt can be dangerous, is what I'm trying to say to you. Okay? Be careful with your debt. Now, a very common thing that I get asked is, should I rent or should I buy? Very common sort of question. Really, it depends on the assumptions that you're making, assumptions about future interest rates, future growth rates, all these sort of things. My personal view is living a debt-free life is what you should be aiming to do. So if you have a home loan, get out of debt as quick as you possibly can. Now, can anyone tell me, if you were to borrow $300,000 from a bank at a typical rate of, let's say, the old 7%, how much interest would you pay on that loan over a 30-year period? About $400,000 in interest. Okay, so you borrow $300,000 that you've got to pay back, but you pay another $400,000 in interest over that 30-year period. Okay, so interest is dead money. Now, of course, the reasons why Australians like to do it is because the price of their property tends to go up over time, other than, of course, over the last 12, 18 months where it's dipped reasonably significantly. Okay, so this is a big issue. My big thing here is saying to people, what does God think here? Have you asked God, should I really be buying or renting? How much money should I really be borrowing here? Because I get the fact that people want to own homes, and I think owning your own home by the time you get to retirement is a good thing. But we can way overdo it. Okay, and many people have way over borrowed way too much money. You know, I've got friends who just think $1 million home loans are just normal these days. Okay, now, Buying a home. There's a couple of principles here. Obviously, save as large a deposit as possible. Now, don't use all of the deposit for the purchase of the house. Keep some money set aside, and maybe if you borrow, put it in an offset account. Many banks will offer you an offset account, so that way you've got money for an emergency. Because what happens if you lose your job 5 weeks into buying the new house? You don't want to put the house at risk straight away. So have some money set aside for emergencies. Now, big important one here. What happens when people want to buy a house? They ring the bank or they ring their mortgage broker. What's the question they ask?
What's my limit?
What's my limit? Exactly. How much will you lend me? And then what do? Go and borrow the whole amount, right? And this is what banks want you to do. They want you to borrow the full amount so that it takes you the full 30 years to pay it back. So the key here is borrow 20 to 30% less than what they will lend you. Now this requires discipline, because what happens, of course, when people go and look for houses is they fall in love with it. The house looks so nice. You can raise our family here. It gets all very emotional, right? But you've got to sit back and say, what can we really afford here? And the big challenge in our society is to start small and work your way up. Start with your 1-bedroom unit, then you go to your 3-bedroom, and then you go to your small house, and then you get your dream house by the time you're 60, not by the time you're 30. Okay? And that's the problem we're up against, this sort of psychological pressure. Okay? So borrow 20% less. Be very careful with things like auctions. Why? Because they're all built around emotion. Okay? So be very careful with that sort of stuff. As I mentioned before, for the whole cash flow issue, is make sure that your mortgage repayments are not more than 30% of your income. I would argue you want it even less than that at the moment, because at some point rates are going to go up. So you want to allow a fairly significant buffer. Obviously, all these things shouldn't affect your ability to give and to live a generous life. The other issue, and this is a tough thing in Australia at the moment, historically, you've been able to buy a house on 3 times family gross income. Okay? That's been the long-term average. Anyone know what house prices are relative to income at the moment? About 6 or 7. Yeah? So in other words, house prices are currently double their long-term average. So that's food for thought in terms of where house prices are likely to go in the future when they're that significantly overvalued relative to their history. Now, this is a graph of household debt in Australia. Back in 1990, when interest rates were 17%, the debt to income ratio was about 60%. Now it's 194%. Now, what this graph really is telling you is that for every dollar that's earned in Australia, $1.94 is borrowed. Compared to 30 years ago, for every dollar earned, 60 cents was borrowed. It's got this massive, massive level of debt in our society. Of course, the million-dollar question is what's going to happen when interest rates rise? So the couple of principles here to live off. The best loan you can ever have is the one you pay back the quickest. Okay? If you've got a home loan, pay it off as quick as you possibly can. Have a big deposit. As I mentioned before, start small and work your way up. Now, the other thing is dealing with mortgage brokers. Now, most of my experience with mortgage brokers has been very positive. I've got mortgage brokers that I refer clients to. They should be able to get you a great deal and explain to you how the home lending system works and get you good deals. However, how do mortgage brokers make their money? Yeah? But they also make their money by selling you the biggest possible loan. Okay? Because they get paid upfront commission based on the size of the loan. And here's what they'll say to you. Oh, you've got your first property, you've now got 300 grand's worth of equity. Why don't you take out another loan? We'll go and buy an investment property. And before you know it, 10 years later, you've got 5 investment properties and $2 million in debt. Okay? They are debt salesmen. Okay? They want you in debt. And you want to do the opposite. Get out of debt, not get into it. And it's all built on this falsehood that property prices will go up year in, year out. Okay? And there are times when they don't. Let's just think of the simple maths of it. This is why people love property. If you buy a property for $500,000 and you borrow $400,000 of that, so you've got 100 grand of your own money in there, if it goes to $600,000, how much money have you made? You've doubled your money, haven't you? Your $100,000 is now worth $200,000. What happens though if that $500,000 property becomes $400,000? You've lost 100% of your money. Okay, but because everyone believes prices will go up forever, surely if prices, and you probably get the same stuff we get in Sydney, prices double every 7 years, that kind of nonsense. But if that were true, you'd borrow as much money as you possibly could, right? So we need to step back from these myths that we hear in the finance industry and the property industry, okay? The other message, particularly for couples, classic mistake young couples make, you get married, what happens 6 months later? Baby comes along, woohoo! The only problem is you've just taken out a home loan based on both incomes. And all of a sudden now you're under huge pressure. And sometimes the spouse, the wife, is then forced to come back to work, 3 months into having a baby, which is the last thing you probably want. Okay, so we've got to think very carefully when we're taking out home loans. And I would suggest, particularly for young couples, that you do it on the basis of one income. Okay, very, very important. The other question I often get asked is, should I pay off my mortgage first, or should I use some of my surplus cash flow to invest? So the general rule of thumb, okay, is to pay off your mortgage first. The reason being is, firstly, you're paying off this debt out of after-tax money, so you need to get a very high rate of return on your investment to justify not paying off your mortgage. Of course, also paying off your mortgage is lower risk because it's the certainty you're paying it off, whereas when you're investing, there's the uncertainty of it going up and down in value. Okay, so general rule, I say this is a general rule because there are other factors at play here and individual circumstances matter. General rule is you pay off your mortgage first. What about borrowing to buy a car? Now, my personal view is cars are a money pit. Good-looking money pits, but they're money pits nonetheless. Okay? And so they're a depreciating asset. But my general rule of thumb is try and avoid borrowing to buy cars. And we touched on credit cards before. Okay? Now, credit cards are very addictive. My suggestion here is, if you are going to have a credit card, is obviously you pay the full amount off every single month so that you're not paying any interest whatsoever. The other thing is, because I think that they are addictive, there's something weird psychologically about them, switch to a debit card. Okay, so you're only spending money that you actually have saved. You're only spending your own money. You're not borrowing somebody else's money. So, final step here, how do we get out of debt? What's a simple process for paying off our debts? Now, I want to give you a 10-step sort of process. Step one is pray about it. Now, there's two things I want you to pray about. One, potentially, you might be asking for forgiveness. God, I went overextended. I bought it because I wanted to keep up with the Joneses, whatever it was. Okay? The second thing is we want to pray for God for help. God, help me to deal with this and get out of my debt. That's step one. Step two, don't take on any more debt. Stop. Cut up your credit cards. Do not take on any more debt. Okay? You're not going to solve a debt problem, although governments seem to think they can, by taking on more debt. The level of debt since the global financial crisis, so most people would acknowledge that the global financial crisis was caused by too much debt. What have the world politicians done in the last 10 years? Added about another 40% to the existing debt. So global debt has gone up 40% over the last 10 years. Staggering figure. Don't take on any more debt. Next step, make a list of all your debts. So, okay, list them, maybe credit card debt, car loans, home loan, etc. And what we want to do is put them in order from highest debt down to lowest. Now, the highest debt will typically be your credit card, where you're paying 18%, down to your lowest, which will usually be your mortgage. And why we want to do that is we want to pay off the higher interest ones first and the low interest rate ones last. Okay, that's the basic logic, makes sense. Typically also your credit card debts are smaller than your home loan, and therefore you want to pay off those ones first and have a sense of achievement that you're actually paying off your debts. Now, thing to be cautious here, you might have seen a lot of banks offer debt consolidation deals, particularly you might have heard of interest-free credit card transfers, where they'll say, we'll give you zero interest for 6 months if you change credit cards. Now, these things are a con. Why? Let's say you've got $5,000 on your National Australia Bank credit card, okay? And ANZ offers you a deal for 0% for 6 months. So you think, oh, this is a no-brainer, I'll switch it over to ANZ and I'll have no interest to pay. But what happens is you switch it over and then you say, well, the first month I'm going to, put some money on my credit card, and then I'm going to pay it all off. So you spend $1,000 in that first month, and you pay it off. And you think you're paying off the $1,000. But what does that bank do? It takes the $1,000 you've just spent, and when you repay it, they take it off the $5,000 that's interest-free, not on the $1,000 you've just spent. So immediately, you're paying interest on it. Okay? So it's a con. So the best thing to do, if you're going to do that, is transfer the money to that credit card, and then don't touch it. Don't use a credit card. Use another one, or don't use a credit card at all, ideally. Okay? Because that's the sort of things they do. Step 6, list any of your assets. Maybe you've got things you don't need. Maybe you've got 2 cars, you only need 1 car. What else have you got? What can you sell on Gumtree? What are your assets that you can get rid of? Do your budget. And what we want to do with our budget is we want to work out what is our surplus cash flow. Okay? Because your surplus cash flow means maybe we can make additional repayments against our debt. You've worked out maybe you can save $200 or $300 extra per month. Put that against your home loan. Cut out any waste, things we don't need. Trust God. Now seek advice. Now maybe some people in this room have very high levels of debt. So if you're feeling really under pressure, you're feeling really stressed by the level of debt, there's a fantastic organisation in Australia called Christians Against Poverty, and they'll help people restructure their debt, deal with creditors on your behalf and so forth. So highly recommend that if you're feeling under massive pressure. And of course, don't delay. Start now. Okay, so that's the key thing here. And don't buy into this debt myth. Our society is built around this idea that you need debt in order to create wealth. Okay, what creates wealth is innovation and people getting up in the morning, starting businesses, going to work. That's what creates wealth, not borrowing to gear yourself up. Okay, and you don't need debt obviously to live anywhere because there's always renting. But the big question, of course, here, before you dive into debt, is ask yourself, why am I really doing this? Do I really need to buy this? Is there a different way of getting there and achieving the same result? Is this debt a symptom of a spiritual problem? Keeping up with the Joneses, that kind of thing. What's your real motive here? We've got to be honest with ourselves about how we're spending our money. But really, the key point I'm trying to make here is get out of debt. Okay? Live a debt-free lifestyle. So, the next thing. How are you going to protect your family? It's a completely different topic here. Many of you will have kids or thinking about having kids. I've got 4 of them. Can't you tell I'm tired? Okay. Actually, it's good when you go away. I get to rest. It's my poor wife. I don't ask the question anymore. How was your night last night? Okay. So here's the thing. Here's the questions you need to be able to ask yourself. What would happen to you or your family if you could not work again? Okay. What would be the impact, financial impact on your family? In terms of paying the mortgage, paying the school fees, saving for retirement? Or what would happen if you or your spouse died prematurely? What impact would that have on your family? That's the reality. Now, in case you're thinking, like so many Australians, it won't happen to me. Okay? Here's the thing. 1 in 3 men and 1 in 4 women will suffer from cancer in their lifetime. Stroke, leading cause of long-term disability in Australia. 40,000 Australians a year have a stroke. Okay? For a 45-year-old, the risk of having a stroke is 1 in 4 for men and 1 in 5 for women. And that's just stroke. Okay? And if you look at cancer and all these other things, they're all very high in terms of the statistics. Okay, now this is the key issue, particularly for young people. It's not the probability of it happening to you that matters. Okay? It's the consequence and the effect that it has on you or your family if it does. Because statistically, the likelihood of a 25-year-old getting cancer is much lower than a 60-year-old, right? So 25-year-olds will say, I'm young, I don't need it. But the consequence of a 25-year-old having something happen to them that means they can't work again is far greater than a 60-year-old who's probably paid off their home. The other thing is you want to get insurance for this reason while you're young and healthy. Because when you become old and grey like me at 43, if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether I would have had sleep apnea, so I sleep at night with a machine, a CPAP machine, and I also have arthritis, which I was not expecting. I got diagnosed with that last year, which basically makes me now uninsurable, okay, for certain types of things like income protection and so forth. Now, thankfully, I've got insurances in place. But here's the thing, you've got to get these things before they happen to you. You've got to get them while you're young and healthy. Okay, that's the key issue here. Because it's not the probability that matters. It's the consequence on you and your family if it does. Okay, that's the real issue here. So, there are 5 main types of insurance. I'll skip through private health insurance, I'll just take that as a bit of a given. But there are things like income protection, life insurance, what we call total and permanent disablement, and trauma insurance. Now, I'll run through each of these very briefly. Life insurance is a bit of an obvious one. You die and a lump sum gets paid to your beneficiaries. Okay? The question, of course, is how much do you need? And the general rule is most Australians under-insure in this area. Because typically you want to obviously be able to pay out your debts. If I use myself as an example, so I've got 4 kids. If I pass away, my wife would want to pay out the debt, pay out the mortgage. Okay? But then she's got to raise still 4 kids. So that's still private school fees and all these sort of things she's got to pay for. And that's what I call your contingent liabilities. So not only do you want to pay off your debt, but you need enough so that my lost income can now help raise those children. So you need enough capital through the life insurance payment to make sure you not only pay off your debts, but you also have enough to live off. Okay? So that you need to think of it that way. You can run these insurances through your superannuation fund, which can be relevant for a lot of you from a cash flow perspective. Rather than being paid out of your monthly budget, it's coming out of your super fund, which is also tax deduction to your super fund, which it isn't to you personally. So lots of advantages with that. But the question here is, what would happen to your family if your income disappeared? Okay, what resources do you already have? How much money have you already got saved, your superannuation, etc. And what would be the ongoing expenses after you passed away? Then we have income protection. Income protection is a unique policy. It pays you 75% of your income whilst you are unable, I use the word unable, to work. Not that you don't want to work. Okay, it'd be nice if you got paid for that. But if you're unable to work, it will pay you 75% of your income. Okay? And now, what's interesting about this policy is it is tax deductible. Okay? You can claim this, and so most of you will get at least 30% of it back. The other thing is you choose 2 things that will affect the cost. One is the waiting period, another is the benefit period. The waiting period is how long from when something happens to you to when you get paid. So when you make a claim to when you actually get paid the money. The longer the waiting period, the cheaper the policy. Then there's the benefit period. This is how long it will pay you for. So as a financial planner, we always recommend clients get policies that pay them all the way to age 65. You've got to be very careful. If you look at the ones in your super fund, there's a good chance it'll only have a 2-year benefit period, which is not much help to you if you're 35. Okay? So there's all these things to sort of consider. Then there's what we call total and permanent disablement. This pays a lump sum if, as it says, you are totally and permanently disabled. Now, unfortunately, this is usually pretty graphic, the things that can happen to you, 2 arms, 2 legs, all these kind of things that may happen. So it's probably the least likely one to happen to you, but it's also probably the most expensive consequence on your life if you are totally and permanently disabled. Because you're not passed away, but you're still alive and still probably a significant expense. But you can no longer work. Okay? Trauma insurance, very commonly claimed on policy. It pays a lump sum on diagnosis. So heart attack, cancer, stroke, there's a whole range of other conditions it pays out on. I had a client who was, I think he was mid-50s. He got prostate cancer and we had a policy with MLC and they paid out $400,000 7 days later. As soon as we provided the medical evidence, they pay it. And the thing with insurance companies, now you see a lot of movies, you think, oh, they're going to try and not pay. Whilst there's some component of truth to that, the vast majority of big, well-known brand companies don't buy the ones you see on TV. Okay? They're cheap for a reason. Cheap means you don't get paid. Okay? So you want proper policies from proper insurance companies that want to maintain their reputation and will actually pay out the claim if it's a genuine claim. That's trauma. So the action point here for you guys to think about, okay, is do an immediate review of your circumstances here. Okay? Review your existing policies and say, do we as a couple, do we have enough money to get by if something were to happen to one of our loved ones? Do a budget to assess the affordability. Okay, implement new policies. So maybe you don't have enough life insurance, you need to up that. Maybe you need trauma insurance because you don't have it, or income protection. All those kind of things, and get those insurances in place because they will make a huge difference to your circumstances. If anyone's got questions that they would like answered from any of the topics we've talked about.
I was wondered, people always say, if you're in a big debt and you want to also contribute 10% of tie, would you try to cut down your debt? What's the question? Cut down your debt first and try to pay as much tie, if it's not 10%, maybe like a 1 or 2, 3%. Of course we put God first, but how would you practically do that as well?
Yeah, so you've got some big decisions there. So if you think you're going to struggle to pay off your debt, then you might say, well, should I sell the place if it's a struggle to really pay it off? Because my view is try not to get yourself into a situation in the first place where it's going to affect those kind of things. Because it's not just tithing, it's also just lifestyle and other things. So that's the first part to it. But I take the view, particularly with giving, that the objective as a Christian is to live a generous lifestyle. And I don't think that's necessarily 10%, because for some people, they could give a lot more than that in order to be generous. So I don't think people should hold themselves to that kind of thing. But I do think the goal should be that you want to become more and more generous over time. That's how I would deal with it. But depending on the circumstance, without knowing people's individual circumstances, it may be appropriate that the place needs to be sold because it's just too hard to pay it back if the debt's too big.
You spoke a lot about debt. If you paid off your mortgage and you've got investment debt, should you make every effort to try to pay that off as soon as possible, or can you just...
If you've got investment loans, yeah. So the answer is yes. My view is you want to always aim to get out of debt. So a lot of people, one of the things at the moment in Australia that's problematic is something like 360 billion in interest-only loans, particularly on investment properties. So a lot of people have gone and bought a $500,000 property and they've borrowed the whole amount. And then, of course, the property goes down, so they're negative equity. In fact, 5% of bank loans in Australia are now negative equity, which is very problematic. So the general rule, I think, is with any investment loan, you still want to pay it back. Now, one of the big things that was in the election was that Bill Shorten said he was going to cut negative gearing. Now, that would have made it. Now, that was going to be grandfathered, so it wouldn't have affected people with the existing debt. But one thing is, Australia, from a demographic point of view, with ageing population, it's probably reasonably safe to assume that taxes are going to go up, not down, because you've got this ageing population hitting retirement, plus we've got this massive debt bubble in Australia, just the government debt. Between, if you allow for government debt and state, so both federal government and states, you're looking at nearly $1 trillion in government debt. So I think it's safe to assume that the tax laws are going to get harsher, not lighter. So my view, pay down your debts. And potentially liquidate too if you think that the investment's no longer going to get you the returns that you think it is going to.
What's your recommendation on putting money in an offset account versus paying down the balance of a loan?
Well, I think it's great to have money in an offset account as your emergency fund. So anyone who has a home loan, to me, you use your offset account as your emergency fund. And you may use it for other things as well, because some banks will give you actually multiple offset accounts. So you might have a holiday account, you can have all sorts of different things. Obviously, at some point, you're going to want to move that money across to actually pay off the debt, as opposed to just letting the offset account build up. But to me, you want to have 6 months' worth of living expenses in the offset account as your minimum, as your buffer. That's how I'd address that, yeah. And once you get above that, move the money across into the loan.
Alex, if you're self-employed
Yep.
and business expenses are above those, I think a lot of this assumes you're not self-employed because that changes a lot of the things budgeting.
It certainly can do. It certainly can do. I mean, depends on what structure you're using. If someone's a sole trader particularly, then your personal expenses and business expenses get very kind of mixed in. Because with my financial planning business, it's a separate entity, so I run separate budgets for that. So it can mix it up. But I think the principles are still identical, even though it's a bit more science. Small business owners are often much better at budgeting for the simple reason that being in small business forces you to learn to be tight. because you've got to learn to manage money well, otherwise you go out of business. And that's why most businesses fail in the first 5 years. And that's usually around cash flow.
Would it be advisable to maybe invest in super versus having an investment?
You should have been here this morning. That's what we talked about this morning. Okay, we've all heard of the Cayman Islands. It's a tax haven, right? What's the best tax haven in Australia? Superannuation. Why is that? Because when you get to retirement, the tax rate on superannuation is... Okay, so it's 15% during your working life, and then it's 0% once you're retired. That's the beauty of it. So to answer your question, absolutely. So that's partly, so this is an issue as we deal with as financial planners all the time. When you're saving money towards long-term goals like retirement, so yes, you want to pay off your home loan and things like that, but putting money into super is extremely sensible, and there's all sorts of tax benefits like salary sacrificing and things like that to boost your superannuation fund. But the big attraction of super is to think of it as a tax vehicle. It's a way of keeping your tax low. That's the big attraction of it. How you invest the money inside superannuation is a separate but relevant issue. But yeah, so the answer is absolutely. For retirement especially.
Question, Alex. Just in regards to coming back to the marriage situation and who manages the household budget, this question sort of comes from, we've talked to couples where the wife feels a bit resentful and having to take on that role of managing the household. They feel that the man has to take the lead, and biblically the man's supposed to take the lead in a family.
Yeah.
But the woman might be more financially savvy.
Yeah.
So what's your...
It was probably a couple of issues wrapped up into that. So there's one's the whole lead issue. So I think you're right, the biblical model of the man leading, that's one thing. But I think firstly, the financial decision making, in my view, needs to be joint. Very strong on this, because as a financial planner, what often happens is husband and wife come and see me. And then what happens in future meetings, only one of them comes to see me. And that's the one that happens to be interested. The other one says, I'm not interested in this sort of stuff. And they outsource it. And so my policy with clients, I say, both of you must come and see me at least once a year, both of you. Because you both have to know where the money's invested, you both have to know the risks you're taking, and you both have to understand what's going on. So to me, the decision making, and why I believe God puts us together, is to complement each other and bring balance to those decisions. So at a decision-making level, it's joint. The administrative part is a separate issue. The administrative part, to me, it's usually done by the person who is more that way inclined. That's my experience. So in my house, that happens to be me. In other houses, it's different. And I don't think it really matters so long as it's agreed and done properly and efficiently, and that both parties understand what is happening and that joint decisions get made. Hope that answers your question. Yeah. So the decision making and the administrative can be separate in that sense.